Double check it's actually recording. Double check. Yep. All right. So what we'll do today is to talk about a few, kind of more advanced, topics. So what I'll do is I'm going back to my notes and start talking from there. I just recently added a few notes, under advanced, techniques. One is how to add a new item, how to add new item option in the list picker. And then the other one, which is just something that I did this morning, is to talk about parameters when you use subroutines in your App Inventor application. Because as it turns out, by default, it only has pass by value parameters. For those of you who may not remember what is pass by value, it means the parameters cannot be changed. You can do whatever you want to the parameters inside the subroutine, but it doesn't affect the original item. So there's no easy way to have a procedure to work on something and then pass the changed item back to whoever called the block to begin with. Okay, but there is a loophole. It's not a loophole, but there is a way to get around this particular limitation. So we can, if we have enough time, we can get to that part. The first one is how to add new item option in a list picker, which I think may be useful for some of your applications, because from what I have seen before in your project proposal, I think a few projects can use this particular feature. So we'll go ahead and deal with this one first. And let me start the AI starter running first, and then we'll go ahead and talk about this project. So I figured the best way to do it is really to explain it while I'm working on it. So here we go. I'll just call this one add new item. All right. So with this application here, what I want to do is to have a list picker, which by default has a few items. But I also want to be able to add new items to the list when I need to. So we'll go ahead and pick a list picker here. So we just drag and drop a list picker. And if you don't like the name, just text for list picker 1, we can go ahead and change it to something that is, I'll just call it options. Okay. All right. So since I only have one single list picker, I'm not going to change the variable name itself because I don't need to distinguish it from something else. Right. So in the blocks, what I'll do is I'm going to go through the initialization in the screen1.initialize block here. And I will just say, well, let's make a global list first. Okay, let's make a global list that is representing all the options. So we go to variables, and then we select initialize global name to something. In this case, the global name is going to be option list. Okay, so I just say this is option list, where it is a list that stores all the available options. And I'll go ahead and initialize this to a certain list here. We'll just make 2 items. Okay, so we'll make the first item a certain text, and a certain second item a certain second text. So we'll just say this one is default option 1, and then the next one is default option 2. Right. So the first thing we want to do is to say, well, is this going to work? Okay, so we'll check and see whether we can actually make our list picker correspond to our option list and allow us to pick one of the 2 default options. So we go to list picker 1, and with a list picker, the most important 2 events are after picking and before picking. The before picking event it happens when someone is clicking on a list picker, but before the list is displayed. So it gives you a chance to initialize the list inside the list picker. So this is a good point of time to associate option list, which is our global variable, with the list that is displayed in the list picker. So what we'll do is we go to list picker 1, and we change its list elements. So we change its elements to a particular list, and that list turns out to be our option list, and we'll see whether it makes the association or not. So let's go ahead and start the emulator. And you will find that lists are very useful, for today's lecture. I mean, almost all of the tricks that we're going to do today, they have to do with lists. Getting there. Well, since it's doing this, let me just kind of switch back to my list, to my notes here. Okay, so the first thing is just to make sure that the list picker is working. And then the second thing we'll do is always append a single item at the end of the elements and make that our add new item. And let's see, are we up yet? Yep, we are. Okay, so with this current application, when I click on the options, it displays default option 1, default option 2, just like we expected. So no big deal here. It's like, okay, this is working just fine. So what we want to do now is to say, okay, in addition to the elements that we are picking up from option list, let's always append a last item here that is representing adding a new item to the list. And that can be done by going to here, and we can always append to the list. So, okay, one way to do it is to get this one out of the way first, and then we can go to lists, and we can append an item to a list before we feed it into the elements here. The other thing we can do is to get the elements, and then we append directly to the elements as a list. So that's the other way to do it. Let's try this way. Let's try the second way, appending to a list. But we are not appending an entire list. We just want to add one more item to the list. So we do have insert list item into a particular list, and we can say where we're inserting. And there is a way to insert to the last item. I think add items to list is going to do it because it just adds one to the end of a list. All right. So in this case, the list is going to be the elements property of a list picker. So we go pick up elements, and there we go. And then we have to add just one single item here. And that one single item, you have to name this one, in a certain way. There are two ways to detect whether you're selecting the last item or not. One is by the name of the item itself, and the second one is by the index of the item itself. So you can identify which one it is, in either way. The index method is more reliable because just in case you have an option added with just that name, the other way, using the index is always going to work. So we can say, add new item. It doesn't want to add a text, so we just have to here add new option in this case. All right, so the app is modified. We'll go ahead and see if it works. So pick an item here, and you can see that now it has add new option added as a last item. So add new option is not a part of my global variable option list. It is a artificially added item, just so that I have one option at the end of the list to add a particular item. Are there any questions at this point of how I appended this one artificial item to the end of the default list? Okay, so the next question is this. The next question is, okay, I click options. It gives me a list to select from, and you can see that it keeps appending, because every time I do the before picking, that it really should not be adding it every single time. I guess I have to. Now there are 3. It's not supposed to do that, because every single time I set elements to global option list, it should pick it up from the beginning, and really should not be adding an option at the end of the elements every single time. That is strange, because it keeps adding to it. All right. Let's go through list picker 1 and see whether there are any other options to get this to work. Okay, we got elements and elements. So we can examine the elements, or we can change the elements using this feature. Do something like this. We can just set the elements to empty first, and then we'll start from scratch from there. So let's see if that works. So we go back to list picker 1, and then we set all the elements to an empty list. So we go back to lists here, and then we make an empty list. So this should initialize everything back to like empty. And then the first thing we do is we pick up all the options from option list, and then we'll start to add new options to it. If this doesn't work, that means the new option is actually added to option list itself, which is kind of related to what I want to talk about in the second half of the class, which is passing by reference. I have a sinking feeling that that really is the case. So we'll give it a try. Options. Yep, even though I initialize everything this time, it is still appending to it. And the reason has to do with the elements of list picker 1 and my global option list. They are basically the same thing. One is not a copy of the other one. So whenever I append to either one, it is doing the same thing to the other one, because they're basically aliases. They are basically different names of the same thing. Right. So if that is not working, what we can also do is to see if we already have that item as the last item. If we do, then we don't append it anymore. Okay. And what type of control structure do we need to do that? Let me describe what I want to do again. If the last item of the list is already add new item, then I don't want to reinsert the last item as add new item. How do what control structure do I need in order to say, okay, sometimes we want to add one item to it, and other times we do not?
Maybe a counter?
Not a counter.
If then.
A conditional statement, an if-then statement. So we go to control, and we pick up an if-then. We don't need an else actually in this case. So we just say that sometimes we want to add new option to the end of the list, and other times we don't. So the question now is, what do we put here? Now we cannot just count the number of items already in the list, because if we just count the number of items in the list, as we add more items, that number is going to change. So what we want to do is to look at the last item and see if it is named add new option. That's what we need to do. So this will be a text comparison. We want to see if we already have add new option at the end of the list. This is not a very good idea, but I'm going to do it like this first, and then we'll change it later to something that is a little bit better. And what do we have to put here is the last item. So we go to lists, and we pick up the last item from the list. To pick up any item from the list, you should use select list item, and then the list itself we can either use global option list or we can use elements because they are now exactly the same thing. So I'll just go ahead and pick. Yep.
What if the items are the same? I mean, let's say the last two data items are exactly the same, or the next item you want to put in is exactly the same as the last data item. That's where I see a possible issue here. You're trying to go by comparing, right, the last item, sort of.
Right.
What if the last two items are exactly the same data items?
Well, I'm counting on the fact that add new option is not the name of an option that you want to add. So if that is this, if you're adding an option that has exactly the same name as add new option, then this logic obviously is not going to work. So we'll basically look at the last item of option list. Now, how do we get to the index of the last item of option list? If you go to lists here, there is a block to count the number of items in the list, and it is the length of a list, and that list is just global option list itself. So in this way, we are now selecting the last item of the entire list, and we are comparing that to add new option. If it is not, we don't have equal here. We want to do a not equal to, because if it's not equal to, then we need to add it. If it is equal to, then there's nothing that we need to do. So how do we turn an equal into not equal to when not equal to is not one of the options here? Come on, you guys know how to do this. Okay, I want not equal to, and the only thing that I can do with comparison is equal to, less than, or greater than. So what is the quickest and easiest way to detect not equal to? Okay, let's go to the logic blocks and see if you can see anything that might be useful. Okay, there we go. Aha, yep, we have a negation, a not. So what we need to do is to just drag a not here and put it in front of the comparison. So that would negate the logic. And if I'm lucky, I can just put it here. Yep, it does work like that.
This time. It liked you this time.
Yeah, it does. Roshi. Yep, thank you. So what this code is now doing is it will say if not the last item of the list equals to add new option, go ahead and add that option to the end of the list. Okay, that's what it's going to do. But now we have a little bit of a problem, because when the app is running, it doesn't trigger the initialization again. Okay, so there's no initialization again. Even if I have a block of code here, it's not going to execute. So for the testing of this program, I'm going to add a button here, just so that I can initialize everything, and I should name the button accordingly. So we'll just say this is initialize, and then we go back to blocks here and put some code associated with the initialization. So we go to the bottom one, and then we say we want to do some initialization, and what we'll do is to do about the same thing here. We'll make a list, and we'll basically set our global variable option list to the default list of default option 1 and default option 2. So this way we can reset everything back to the beginning stage. And the application hopefully is still running. So this time I can click initialize and then click options. And you can see it has an add new option here. And if I click it again, if my logic works correctly, it should not have to add new option. And that works just fine. Right, so we got that logic out of the way. We now have a reliable way to add that one last option called add new option to the end of the list. So the next question is, what are we going to do when that is clicked? Okay, so the handling of each of these options need to be slightly different. if I select default option 1 and default option 2, I should just do whatever that is supposed to do. On the other hand, if I click on add new option, I'm expecting it to open up either a text box or some way for me to enter something, so that becomes the new option. Is that making any sense? Okay. So now the question is, how do we do that? Well, there are two things that we need to do first. The first one is we go to list picker 1, and then we say after picking, we have something to do now. After picking, in other words, after I click on a particular item in the list picker, we need some kind of logic here to deal with. Okay, first of all, am I selecting add new option or not? If so, I got something to do. If not, I have the usual thing to do to change either the label of something, to change a value of something that I'm tracking. So we need a differentiation code here. So we'll go ahead and put in a conditional statement, and this time we do need an else because there are two branches that we need to deal with. The two branches correspond to what if we just selected add new option, and what if we did not select add new option, and those two need to be handled differently. Are there any questions about where we are going at this point? Nope, this is all good? All right. So what we'll do is we are going to use the index to detect whether we have selected the last item or not. Okay, that is actually the easiest way to do it. So this will be a math comparison. It's no longer a string comparison. It is just a math comparison. We're comparing two numbers. The first number is the index of the item that I just picked from the list picker. So we go to list picker 1, we scroll down and find the index of the item that I have just picked, which is selection index. So we put it on one side of the comparison, and then on the other side we want to compare against the length of the list. So on the other side we want to go to lists and use the length block on the selection, the elements of the selection of a list picker. So now we go to elements. So if these two are the same, that means I just picked the very last item of the entire list, and I should do something about it because what the user has done so far is to request to add a new option to the list. If it is not the same, in other words, in this case can only be less than, that means that means a regular option has been selected. Are we doing okay so far with this? Kind of? Okay. just so that this becomes more visual, I'm going to add a label just so that we can see which option is selected. Okay, so if I select a regular option, text for label 1 will be changed to reflect the option that I have selected. So we'll go ahead and go back to the blocks here to get that part of the code working first. So going back to here, I'm only going to handle the else part here, which is to change the text of label 1 to reflect which option I have selected. So we set label 1 text to the option that I have selected. There are several ways to do this to find out which the text of the item that I have selected. The quickest and easiest way is just to look at selection, because that actually refers to the text of the option that I have selected. And we're going back to the program here, go to options, and you can see how default option 1 is now chosen, and if I select default option 2, it is also chosen. So even with the code right now, what happens if I select the last one? In other words, what if I select add new option? What should happen to the label? Nothing. Exactly. Absolutely nothing should happen to the label because I already have the conditional statement to branch one way or another. But it's always a good idea to test it just to make sure that this logic is working. Okay, so it is working just fine. Okay. All right, so we got most of the logic working already. The only part that is missing is this part here. Now you can, if you want to, use a text box that is normally hidden and display the text box to enter the text of a new option. Okay, you can do that, but it's not really the best way to do it. The best way to do it is to use a notifier. So I'm going to go back to the designer here, and this time I'll pick a notifier to help me with this little problem here. And then I go back to the blocks to add some more code to it. So what we want to do at this point is to use a notifier to open up a dialog box to prompt the user to enter the text for the new option. Okay. So we go to notifier 1, and you can see, the purple blocks. One of the purple blocks is going to do what we need to do. All right.
Show choose dialog? Did show choose dialog?
The choose dialog allows you to choose from the two options.
Okay.
So that's not gonna
Text dialog.
show text dialog. Let's see. Let's look at the options here. Shows a dialog box where the user can enter text. That's exactly what we want. Okay. So we put this block here, and basically say if the user has selected the item of adding a new entry to the list, we're going to display a message first, okay, and also a title. So we just drag two text blocks here. The message is really just okay, I'll explain that here. The title is what is displayed on the top of the dialog box, so that should be shorter. So we can just say enter specify new option, and then the message can be a little bit lengthier. You can include like tips and clues and whatnot. So for this, in this case, I'll just say enter the text that describes the new option being added. All right. So we'll go ahead and test the program only with this block added, just to see what it looks like. I think most of us kind of know what it looks like, but we'll go ahead and do it again. So options, and select add new option here, and this is what it looks like. Okay, and that's exactly what we want. Okay, specify new option is the title. Enter the text that describes the new option being added. So now I can actually enter something, right? So I can say custom option 1, and then press the OK key, and then we look at options again. Hey, nothing has changed. Well, because nobody cared about the text that I just entered in the dialog box. Okay, so we need one more event handler to get this done. The new event handler that we need is associated with the notifier 1. Under notifier 1, you can see that there's one thing that says after text input with the response to it. So this event after text input happens when I press the enter key after I type something into the text entering dialog box. Okay. So this would be the entry point, or this is the trigger for me to do some processing. Okay, so I can use this opportunity to insert a new item into the list, so that I would end up with that item in the list. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and see what we need to do here. Response is actually the text that is entered, so that's exactly what we need. So obviously, what we have to do has to do with the list. So we'll go through what we can do with the list and find out which one is the one that we need to do. Just because we see this little notch here, that kind of limits us to blocks like this, and like this, and so on. So which one do you think we should use in this case? We have used the other one before, which is add items to list, which always add to the end of a list. Do we want to add to the end of the list? Nope. Because the end of the list has add new option, and we kind of want to keep that one there at the end of the list. So we want to add to as the second last item of the list. Append. Append basically is the same thing as add to items, except it goes all the way to the end. Say again?
Insert item at a certain index.
Yep. insert is the one that we want. So we'll pick this item first, and then we'll figure out what to put into these 3 slots. The list one is easy. Okay, the list is easy because we got one global variable for that purpose already. So we'll just say it is our global option list. Okay, the item is easy too. What we are adding is just the response, which is the text that I just entered in the dialog box. The question is, where am I inserting?
List length minus 1. List length minus 1.
Yep, it's the length of the option list minus 1. Now, it doesn't hurt to double check and make sure. So when we go back to insert list item, it says insert an item into a list at the specified position. So, well, I'm not 100% sure whether it should be the length or the length minus 1. It depends on whether it's inserting before the index or inserting after the insert, after the number. I'm suspecting it's inserting before, so we actually have to use the length of the list as this particular item and not the length minus 1. Plus, not minus 1. Yep.
No, that's inserted as the last item.
Because insert, you use add. If it is the last item, you just say add. Because you get into that problem one way or another. If it is always after, then there's no way to insert before the first item. Right? But we already have a way to append to the very end of the list, which is the add block and also the append block. So both of those will append to the end already. So I'm thinking this one, the word insert usually implies it is inserting before and not after. So it doesn't say specifically, so we'll go ahead and interpret it as inserting before, which means we have to use just the length of the list itself and not the length minus 1. All right. So that should do it. Okay. But because I'm adding this new item to the list, to the option list, I probably want to make this the actual item being selected at this point. So I'm going to replicate this block here and basically say, oh, that is also what we are selecting at this point. So we put response to the text of the label so that becomes, so not only are we adding a new option, it also by default becomes the quote unquote selected option. Let's go back to the emulator and give it a try. So we want to go back and then do the options again, add new option, and this time we'll name this one custom option 1. Click OK. And then we want to, you can see custom option 1 is automatically entered here. And then when we click options, it is also appearing here just fine. Yep, that's exactly where it's supposed to go. Now, if you want to maintain these custom options in your application, just make sure you store it into TinyDB. Just put the entire list into the TinyDB, and then when your application loads, you pull it from the TinyDB, so this way it becomes persistent. So are there any questions about how to add a new option using list picker and also a notifier component?
I'm just wondering if you could put the AIA file on Google.
Absolutely. Just the way it is?
Yeah.
That's good enough? Okay. Let's go ahead and export. Go back to Moodle. And I'll put it under advanced techniques because that's exactly where the slide is or where the topic is. So I'm adding a new file. Add new option to list picker. Now you guys have access to the program that I just worked on, and that's the first half of today's advanced topics. The second one is closely related to the first one. So what I'll do is I'm going to start a new project. I have one already created for this, but I want to start a new one just so that I can kind of work on it from scratch. So we'll start a new project, and I'll just call this pass by reference. Okay. How many people know what is passing by reference as opposed to passing by value? Okay, we have a few people. Okay, for those of you who do not, passing by value means the parameter is a copy of whatever you use to fill that slot in a call. And whatever you do to the parameter is only done to the parameter itself. Okay? It doesn't get reflected back to the original item. Passing by reference, on the other hand, means you're passing a way to find an item to a subroutine. So the subroutine has a way, quote unquote, has a way to go back to the original item and change the original item. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. So what I want to do in this case is to have a label so that I have a way to kind of show the result of something. And this program is only going to count, it's a counter application. When I click a button, the label is supposed to reflect a number that goes up. Okay, every time I click a button, it goes up by 1. So here's a button, and I'll label the button accordingly. So the first one is going to be increment, but this is using passing by, what I call passing by value, or abbreviated it is by val. Okay. And then the blocks would look like this. I have a global variable, and I'll just call this my counter. And as a counter, it has an initial value of 0. So nothing really too mysterious here. I go to button 1 and I say, when button 1 is clicked, I want to increment the counter and update the label accordingly. But that would be pretty simple, okay? That's way too boring. So what I want to do is I'm going to use a procedure, okay? A procedure is a subroutine, and in this case, I call this procedure increment. And it has one parameter to specify what I am incrementing. So in this case, my parameter x is what I'm incrementing here. So going back to variables, I'm going to set x to x plus 1. Okay, so we go to math, we specify the add block here, and then we specify x on one side, and then we specify 1 on the other side. So now I'm incrementing x. So what I'll do in this case is to say, oh, since I have a procedure to add 1 to x, let's make use of that on my global variable counter. So I go to procedures again, and this time instead of defining a procedure using the first 2 blocks, I'm just calling a procedure that is already defined. So I put this block here, and then I have to specify what goes into the slot of x. And that turns out to be my global variable counter. After this, I'm going to use the label to reflect the new value of my global variable counter. So I go to label 1, go to set text, and change it to my global variable counter. Not set, get. There we go. All right. So if increment is successfully incrementing the original item, which in this case is global counter, then I should be seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, because counter is initialized to 0. Is that making any sense? It seems like it would work. I mean, if you look at the warnings, there's absolutely no warning and no errors whatsoever. Okay. So we go to my emulator, and this is my new application here. And you can see that no matter how many times I click the button, the number doesn't change. It's always 0. It doesn't change at all. Okay, that's because by using passing by value, the increment procedure is only changing the value of the parameter itself, which had the same value as the global variable counter when it was created. But once it was created, the linkage between x, the parameter, and the global variable counter is lost. Okay? So it doesn't matter what I do to parameter x, it doesn't change the variable at all. Okay, that's kind of a bummer, right? So what I'll do next is I'm going to use another way to make a counter. And this time it is going to be a little bit awkward, okay? So this is going to be my second counter. I'll just call this counter 2. But counter 2 is not just a number. Counter 2 is going to be a list. And it's going to be a list of only one item. And that one single item is 0. Which is kind of odd, right? I mean, why would I make a list where there's only one single item in the list, okay? Well, the reason why I'm doing this is because when you pass a list as a parameter, it is always passed by reference. In other words, the parameter becomes an alias to the same list as the original item. If you make changes to the list inside the procedure, you're making changes to the original list. Okay. That is why we are using this to initialize counter 2. But the problem is when the app is already running, it doesn't trigger this particular operation. So I need another way to initialize counter in this case. Let's see. I suppose I can use. Yeah. I'll just put a button here to do the initialization. So I'm gonna pull another button, 2 more buttons. I need 2 more buttons here. The second button is going to be changed to increment, and this time it's passed by reference using counter 2. And then the last button is my initialization button. So I just say initialize. So this way, when I go back to the blocks, I have a trigger point to reinitialize everything. So I go to button 3, which is my initialization trigger. And I just have to set both variables back to where they're supposed to be. So I'll set counter to a 0. And I'm going to set counter 2 to be a list with a single number of 0. I have to do this because App Inventor does not restart the application, and if the application is not restarted from the beginning, I don't get to initialize the global variables. I'm pretty sure counter 2 is initialized correctly in this case because I just added it, but just to be sure, I have a button to do the initialization. And then after that, I have to do something about button 2. Button 2, when it's clicked, I'm going to call a subroutine. But this time, I cannot use the same subroutine here, because when you look at subroutine increment, it's assuming x is a number, because I'm adding 1 to it, right? But the other counter 2, with counter 2, it is a list with a number in it. So I cannot just pass the list to x in increment and expect it to work. That just won't work. So what I need to do is to have another increment procedure here, and this time it is designed to handle counter 2, which is a list with a single number. So I go back to procedure here, and I say, okay, I'm going to define a new procedure. And for the lack of creativity, I'm just going to call the new procedure increment 2. And it also has one single parameter, which I would just call x. X is fine here. But this time when I'm adding 1, I'm not adding 1 to x itself. I'm extracting the first element out of x, which is a list, and replace that element with a value that is 1 added to the original value. Okay, is that part okay? And as it turns out, there are certain blocks that can help me in this case, because there is a block to replace a single item in the list. So I'm going to start with that. So the replacement block, or the replace block here, allows me to specify which list I'm talking about. Now here I'm doing it without any error checking. When you do something like this, you should probably do some error checking first, okay? Do you guys want to see how to do all the error checking, the whole enchilada? Okay, we'll do the whole enchilada then. Okay, if you want to do the whole enchilada, you need to do a conditional statement first, just to make sure that X in fact is a list. And there's a way to do that, because you can always say is a list and ask the question, is X a list? Because if X is not a list, I got nothing to do. Okay, it has to be a list. Now if X is a list, the next question is, does it have a single entry, or does it have at least one entry? Sorry? Is it empty? Then that's the next question, right? So then we can use another control block, use another conditional statement, and say, okay, at this point we know X is a list. The next question is, does it have at least one item? There are two ways to do it. You can use the length and see whether the length is at least one, or you can use, is empty as a block. So either way will work just fine in this case. So you can basically say, if it is not empty, then I got something to do. So we also have to go to logic here and pull a negation, not, and then we use the same thing here, and we say, if X is a list and it is not empty, then we got one more thing to check, because we have to make sure that the first item of this list is in fact a number, because if it is a string, it doesn't work either. So we have another control block here, another if-then, and this time we're only checking the first item of the list. At this point, what we know already is X is a list and it is not empty, so there's at least one item. So it is time to check whether that item is a number or not. So we go to math, and we say is a number, and then we ask, is the first item of this list a number? So now we have a selection block here to select that particular item out of X, and I'm going to hard code this one to 1. And if all the tests pass, if all 3 conditions pass, then we are ready to do something about it. This is, with all the error checking. Okay, without these blocks, it will still work in this program, because I know for sure that X is a list and it has a number in it. But this will give you, the ability to catch what if it is not the case. Now, if you're catching these things, you should probably add an else case to report an error and say that, we got a problem here, because it's not supposed to happen. Okay. Question?
Let's do that.
Have you complained all day long? It's like,
yes.
Nah. Okay, I'm just gonna shortcut it and say that, okay, we'll only do something when all the conditions are met. Okay, so we want to replace an item in a list. That list, once again, is X. The index is going to be 1, and the replacement is going to be what used to be there, but 1 added to it. So now we go to the math block here, we pick up the addition block, and the first item can be just 1 itself, the constant, and then the second item is going to be the first item of X. So we have to go to list again, and then we say select item. The list is going to be X. Yeah, could do that. Just block, copy and paste. There we go. Or I could use a local variable, and so I can refer to it only once. Either way works. All right, so now I have a whole big chunk of code here just to implement passing by reference. But the question is it going to work? Okay, that really is the big question. So we go back to button 2 click, and then we say the first thing we want to do is to call increment 2 with counter 2. So we want to select a get block here and select global counter 2, and then we'll change the label text to the value of the first item of counter 2. So we go to label 1 and we say set text to the first item using select. counter 2. All right. Let's go back to the emulator and see if it works. Ah, it just crashed. Reset. So the bottom line is, with lists, when you make a copy of a list, when you have an equal symbol, when you set a certain variable to a list, the new one becomes not a copy of the other one, it becomes an alias of the other one. In other words, when you set a variable to a list, it is not making a brand new copy of the list. It is just saying, oh, okay, you are also linking to that list here. This is a rather obscure feature of App Inventor that is not really documented. And I like those features. Alright, so it's loading up. Alright, so what we'll do is we'll check the first one. Doesn't work, we know that one. Right, the second one actually works. So you can use a list to implement quote-unquote passing by reference, but it does take a little bit of work to get all the error checking out of the way, and then you have to mess around with using a list because you have to basically use a list to wrap around the thing that you want to change in a subroutine. Are there any questions about what we just talked about here? Questions? Do you have any use of something like this? You might. Okay. Because the use of a subroutine is helpful because you don't have to replicate duplicate the blocks of code everywhere. You can just call a subroutine to do it, and this overcomes the one big limitation of subroutines in App Inventor, which is not being able to change what you're passing to it. Any other questions?
You push the middle? You push the code middle?
Absolutely. In a way, I'm kind of glad that you guys remind me to upload, these kind of sample programs, because it means that it is actually useful to you, as opposed to we don't care, this is useless, I don't need to know this.
Yeah. Create a macro to do it for you.
This is called pass by reference. Here we go. Okay, so the next question is, what if you don't want the parameter to be an alias of the original item? What if you really want the subroutine to work with a copy of a list and not the original one? Then you have to clone the entire list. So the question is, how do you clone an entire list?
Use the clone list block.
Create another list and assign a context. Which is part of that example.
Well, let's go to blocks and find out what we can do with lists.
Copy list.
Makes a copy of a list, including copying all sublists. That's it. So if you need to pass a list by value, it is still doable, but it is the subroutine itself that has to make a copy first and only work with the copy. So all the changes do not get reflected in the original one. Okay. I'm kind of glad that it has. Well, in a way, I'm glad that it has this block here. In a way, it kind of took the fun away from me from making this clone block here. But that's good. It's good to have a block to do it already. Any questions at this point? Well, I got a lot of fun with, the easiest way to do it, which is really, really obscure, but I have the code already, is to use, I know you guys already know what I'm thinking. You can use the JSON encoder, encode the entire thing, and then stick that whole text back into a JSON decoder. So that will basically make a copy for sure, right? But it's not going to be very efficient. That's going to be a pretty slow way to do it. All right, so we are done with this one too. Are there any questions about what we have just done today with lists? Okay. Now I do want to show you another thing that you can do with lists, and it can come in handy, especially when you have a structure of things that you want to represent, and they are key value pairs inside the list itself. So let me kind of describe what I'm talking about first, and I'll use a text editor to make my point here. Sorry?
That's key value pairs?
Yep. So with a list, we already know that a list can store just about anything, right? We can store numbers, okay? We can store text, okay? And we can store even another list, okay? So let's say this is just a 1, 2, and text 2. So this can be a list, okay? Not a problem. But when you use lists just like this to store something that is structured, you have to remember which index is storing what, right? Because you have to remember the first item is a number, and you have to remember the purpose of that number. The second item is text, and you have to remember the purpose of the text, and so on. For instance, if you want to remember, let's say, the name of a person with phone number and stuff like that, you can do that already. So you can say, tag is the first name, and then Ouyang is the last name, and then the phone number, is 4444444, which actually is a real number. That's not my number. But when you look at a list, sorry?
555.
I think 4444444 is the phone number of a lawyer.
It is.
Yeah.
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 There you go.
Yeah, car accident type of a lawyer. Yeah. We say ambulance trailing, not chasing. They just got themselves attached to the end of an ambulance. Okay, so, but the problem with this approach is after a while, you have to remember index 1 is the first name, index 2 is the last name, and then index 3 is the phone number. And you cannot get the order wrong, okay? Another way to go about doing this is to basically say the first one is first name. So we say first name is the key, and then the value is tag. And then we have the second one as last name is the key, and then the value is Ouyang. And then the last one is phone number, and then the value is 4444444, like so. So this approach, the second approach here, is called using a key value pair within a list. Okay, and the nice thing is now the order is not important anymore. Okay, in other words, I can have another list, but with the orders wrong. Okay, not exactly the same as this one. So I can do it like this, and it still means exactly the same thing, because I'm still retrieving. I'm retrieving tag by its key, which is first name. Yes. No, I'm just using the typical Lisp representation, so there are no commas to separate items in a list, just a space. Okay, and App Inventor already has features to support this to a certain extent. So when you look at all the blocks supported by list, there is one that is particularly useful to do this.
Bottom.
Lookup in pairs. Yep. So the last block, lookup in pairs, is going to support the looking up of items using key value pairs. So in this case, key is going to be last name, first name, or phone number. Pairs is the list itself. And the last item, which is not found, is the same thing as not found in TinyDB. When you look up TinyDB, it's basically saying, okay, if it is not found, what am I supposed to return? Now you have to choose not found carefully to make sure that it cannot possibly be one of the values that can be returned, okay? Because otherwise you cannot distinguish, did I not find the item, or is this actually the value of the thing that I'm trying to look for, okay? So you have to make sure that not found is obscure enough that it cannot possibly be the value that it is supposed to return, okay? But this is the only support, okay? It supports looking up a list with the key value pairs in it, but it doesn't give you a convenient way to create a list like this or to maintain a list like this. In other words, what if I have a key value pair list already and I just want to change one of the items? Now this will look up the actual value, but it doesn't let you change that value. Am I making any sense? So what do?
Conditional statement.
Sorry?
Conditional statement.
You can use a conditional statement. You can make your own procedure, right, to change a particular value of an item in a key value pair list to something. Okay? Are there any questions about this? So let's say that's what I want to do. Okay? Now we want to go ahead and actually see how to do it. I'm going to write a procedure to basically do the reverse of looking up. So I'm not looking up something, I want to change something. Okay, I'm not getting the value of a key, I'm changing the value of a key, which is actually fairly common, right? Because if your application has a form of some sort, okay, and you are creating a record of the entire form, it's not just displaying the form that is useful. If the user use a text field or text box to change one of the fields, you want to update the form itself too. Okay? So the question is, how do you update just one item? Because occasionally you don't want to recreate the entire thing, you just want to change one single item. So let's go ahead and see how we can do something like that, the reverse of looking up a list. I'm just going to put it into the same thing here, you know, just so that I don't create a new program to do this. Well, I suppose I can create a new program to do it. Nah, I'll just do it here. So we'll go ahead and create a new procedure, and this new procedure is I'm just gonna name the procedure according to what it does. Okay, so it will change value in key value pairs in this case. So what we need would be certain parameters. The first parameter is going to be my list of pairs. So, oops. Click this one first. And the list is called pairs. The second one is what key I'm looking for. And then the last one is the value, the new value that I want to put into that key. So I put it here. And we'll say new value. So, all right, so now we have all the parameters set up. I'm gonna skip the part that checks that pairs is actually, well, might as well do it. So I go to control, put a conditional statement here, and say that I don't want to do anything unless pairs is a list already. So we go to here, we look for is a list, make sure that pairs is in fact a list, and then we can go forward from here. Okay. So inside this block here, inside this little block here, I can use the logic to find out, first of all, do I already have an entry corresponding to this key? If I do, I want to change the value of that pair. If not, I want to create a new key value pair so that the new value is associated with this key. Now, so the default behavior of this procedure is to create an item when it is not there already. Depending on your application, you may not even want to do that. You may want to say, oh, if the key does not even exist at this point, don't do a single thing about it. All right. So let's go ahead and find out, how we can do something like this, and find out, is it easy to do, and if so, how easy is it? When you go to control, we have one really cool feature in control that deals with lists, and it has to do with for each item in the list. Okay, so this is really helpful because at this point we know that pairs is already a list. So we can say, oh, okay, let's go through each and every single item in this list. What should each item be in a list like this, in a key value pair list? Each item in this list should be a string or a list. Which one? Nope, should be a list. It should be a list of two items. The first item is the key, and the second item is a value. Now the value itself can be a list on its own. Okay, I don't really care what it is, but it can be anything. But the first item has to be a key. So once again, the first thing I want to do is to double check whether I'm dealing with a list or not. So I would double check and say, is that also a list? But this time I'm not dealing with pairs anymore. I'm dealing with item, which is a single item in this key value pair list. Okay, so if each one is a list, then I have other things to do because it has to be non-empty. If it is empty, I don't have a single thing to do. So once again, we have to go to list and see if it is empty. Actually, I need to do the negation first. Another conditional statement. If item is not empty, it's empty. There we go. All right. If the item itself is a list and it is not empty, I'm going to assume the first item of this list is the key. So now I have yet another control block here, which is also a conditional statement, to do the comparison, to do the text comparison. So I now do a text comparison and compare two items and say that only if they equal, I got something to do. So what I'm comparing here is the first item, is the first thing from item, okay? Because item is the name of a variable, so I have to be careful about that. So we go to select the first thing out of item, against the key that we are looking for. So if it is the same, then we have just found the thing that I need to deal with. Okay. So when I found the item that I am dealing with, I can now just change the second item if there is a second item. So at this point, I'm just going to be assuming the second item does exist, that this is not just the key itself, there's always a second item. So now I can go to list again and then use the replace block here to replace the second item of the second thing of item. I have to be very careful about what I'm saying here. So this is about the second thing of item, and the replacement is the new value. So here we have new value, and that's it. Now, so far this logic will only do one thing, okay? Only if this particular key value already exists in the list, in the original pairs list, it will do something about it. What if it is not there to begin with? Well, first of all, do we even know that it's not there? Not at this point, right? At this point, there's nothing to indicate after the loop completes. There's nothing to indicate that, oh, we couldn't even find this particular item. So what we need now is a local variable to indicate, something, which is whether we found the item or not. So we can go to variables, and this time we just need a local variable. So we'll put it here, and then put this entire thing inside here. And I'm just going to call this found, and found is initialized to false. In other words, unless I find it, I'm going to say, nope, it's not here. But as soon as I find it here, which is matching the text of the first thing of the item to the key that I'm searching for, I'm also going to change found to true. So we go to variables, and then we say set found to true. So with this logic here, after the for each block, if found continues to be false, I know that that particular key did not exist in the original list, and it's time to add it to the list. So here we need another control block here after the for each at the same level. And this is where graphical programming hits a particular limitation. I can't really see the entire thing anymore, but App Inventor has a way to solve this problem, well, to a certain extent, because I can do this. I can right click and then say collapse the block. So I can see, okay, right before the conditional statement that I'm dealing with right now is the for each block. Okay, so that really kind of helps because I can see the context of this, if-then statement. I know it is at the right level. So this basically is just saying if not found, right? Because if not found, and found can either be true or false because of the way it's set up. If not found, then I'm just going to add this item because that key did not exist in pairs to begin with. So in this case, I'm going to use append. See, we have a use of append finally. Nope, not really. Append is appending to the entire list, so we just need add actually in this case. So we're adding one item to the list, but this time this list is pairs itself. And the item that we're adding is going to be a list by itself with only two items. The first item is the key. The second item is the new value. In other words, I am creating a new key value pair and append it to the end of pairs if I cannot find it.
So it's get new value, not set new value.
Sorry?
It's get new value, not set new value.
It's get new value, that is correct.
You gotta pass it.
Because it's a parameter. So that's it. So this is the counterpart of find a particular item, assuming a list is a key value pair list. This is the counterpart to change it, to change the value of a particular key. I'm going to save this document again, just so that you guys can have a copy of it, and feel free to test it. Fairly sure it's gonna work, but then that's what we call famous last word. Let me go back to Moodle and re-upload. I'm gonna make it a new file, just so that the two files do not, so that we know which one is which one. So add. So this one is to change value of a key in a KB pair list. By reference 1. It's okay when I upload this because once I upload it, I can change the name to change value of AB pair. Oh, forgot the extension. You will forgot something. It's okay, I can Still changing here? No, it kept. Oh, smart. Yep. If I don't specify an extension, it knows to keep the extension. So that's okay. All right. So you have this procedure. I haven't tested it yet, but I have done it before. I've done it before in App Inventor 1, and the problem with App Inventor 1 was that the replace block itself didn't work either. So I had to implement my own replace block, which was kind of a hassle. But the replace block now works in AI2, so this should be good to go. All right. Any questions? Questions? Right. Well, we are kind of running out of time today. So are you guys going to integrate all this stuff or some of this stuff into your projects? Might be helpful. Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad that we worked on something that is actually useful in your projects. But that's the whole point of this class. I don't want to do something that is actually not useful, in your projects. If you come into class late, there's the row sheet. Just make sure that you sign off on the row sheet before you leave today. And I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Yes? Question? Sorry. Well, the algorithm part is something that you have to think about. You have to. It has to be done by.
When I sent the file, I came to him and I asked him, you open it?
Yep.
Yes.
But I think I tried emailing to you, Rob.
Oh, I gotta remember that. When is it there?
It's for this Monday.
For this Monday?
Yeah. Or
Today.
upcoming Monday.
Oh, next Monday. Okay.
So I'll be showing on
fine.
the weekend and coming back on that day, but it's like a 12-hour trip that we're starting that morning.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. It'll be okay?
Should be okay.
I'm going to miss this class and your 360 class in the
I know.
afternoon. I already signed it.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, will you have internet access where you're going?
Yes.
Okay.
I hope. God, I hope. I'll have mobile phone at least, so.
Yeah, if your 4G is still going to work, then you can still kind of keep up with the class. So I think it will be okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.